My name is Amber. At 33 years old, I never expected to be walking down the steps of the Denver County Courthouse holding divorce papers. Minutes after the ink dried, officially severing my legal ties to Derek, I called my dad. Fire all 21 employees my in-laws planted in our company. Thank God I did, because that evening my former mother-in-law came over, kicking down my door, demanding I reinstate them. Before I share exactly how I dismantled their parasitic empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how people who mistake your kindness for weakness get exactly what they deserve. There were absolutely no tears streaming down my face today. Instead, I felt only a very cold, calculated precision. The wind bit through my coat, but the chill was nothing compared to the ice running through my veins. For 3 years, I had played the quiet, submissive wife, while Derek and his mother Barbara infested my family life. But that tether was finally cut. I was finally free from their constant toxic control, and it was time to get to work. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed a number I knew. The phone rang once before my father answered. Richard was the founder of Apex Logistics, a company he built into a regional empire. His voice sounded tired but expectant. I skipped the pleasantries. It is done. Dad, I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. Purge the payroll. Every single one of Barbara's relatives. Lock them out of the building right now. I heard my father let out a long breath, carrying years of exhaustion. Are you sure, Amber? He asked. Derek and Barbara will make this ugly. They already made it ugly, I replied, stopping at the crosswalk. We are returning the favor. Revoke their keycards. Cut off their server access. I want every cousin, nephew, and family friend escorted off the property by security. As I crossed the street toward my car, my mind flashed back to how we reached this boiling point. It was a slow, creeping invasion. When my father suffered a severe heart attack 3 years ago, I was terrified. Derek stepped in, playing the supportive husband offering to manage the operations of Apex Logistics so my father could recover. I was grateful then, blinded by what I thought was partnership. I worked long hours at a forensic accounting firm, trusting my husband to protect my family legacy. But Derek did not come alone. He brought his mother, Barbara. She viewed other people's success as a personal insult and saw my father's vulnerability as an open vault. Under Barbara's manipulative guidance, Derek packed the company payroll with their family members. First a cousin who needed a warehouse job, then a nephew suddenly appointed as a regional manager, despite having no experience. Before long, there were 21 of them. 21 incompetent, entitled people draining the company accounts, collecting salaries for jobs they never showed up to perform. Whenever I questioned the bloated payroll or asked why Barbara was treating the executive suite like her personal country club, Derek turned it around on me. He told me I was ungrateful and paranoid. He said he was breaking his back to save my father's business while I was just obsessed with spreadsheets. He weaponized my father's health, claiming that if I started a war over the staff, it would cause another heart attack. So I stayed quiet. I played the good wife. I smiled at family dinners while Barbara made passive-aggressive comments about my career and my inability to keep my husband happy. I let them think I was a defeated woman who would eventually surrender the entire company to them. They severely underestimated who they were dealing with. They saw a quiet wife. They did not see the forensic accountant who spent the last 8 months quietly mirroring the company servers from her home laptop, tracking every single stolen dime. I reached my car and tossed the divorce decree onto the passenger seat. The drive through Denver traffic felt entirely different today. The oppressive weight sitting on my chest for 3 years was finally lifting. Derek and Barbara thought they had maneuvered me into a corner, leaving me broken and scrambling for scraps, while they solidified their grip on Apex Logistics. They had no idea the divorce was not a tragedy. It was a carefully orchestrated legal maneuver designed to sever Derek from my personal assets before I dropped the hammer on their parasitic operation. I pulled into the parking garage of my downtown apartment building. It was a modern, secure building I leased under my own name months ago when I first initiated my exit strategy. Walking into my apartment, I felt a profound sense of peace. The space was completely mine. There were no golf clubs leaning against the walls, No passive-aggressive notes on the counter, no trace of Derek or his overbearing mother. The afternoon sun poured through the windows, casting a warm glow over my carefully chosen furniture. I dropped my keys on the entryway table and walked straight to the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of crisp white wine I had been saving for exactly this occasion. The pop of the cork echoed in the quiet apartment, a celebratory sound, signaling the end of one nightmare and the beginning of my retribution. I poured a generous glass, taking a moment to simply stand at the kitchen island and breathe. For the first time in years, I did not have to brace myself for Derek walking through the door complaining about how hard he worked for my family. I did not have to prepare for a phone call from Barbara criticizing my domestic skills. The payroll was purged. The locks were changed. The cancer was cut out of my family business. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, savoring the taste and the absolute silence of my sanctuary. I walked over to the living room sofa and sat down, slipping off my shoes and letting out a deep sigh of relief. The plan had executed perfectly. My father was safe, the company was secured, and I was finally entirely free. I closed my eyes, letting the stillness wash over me. But the peace did not last long. Less than 3 hours had passed since I stood on the courthouse steps. The sun was just beginning to dip below the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across my living room floor. I was halfway through my second glass of wine, mentally preparing for the meetings I would lead tomorrow, when the heavy silence of the apartment was violently shattered. A loud and aggressive banging echoed from the hallway. Before I could even set my wine glass down on the coffee table, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass ripped through the air. My front door was violently kicked open, crashing hard against the interior wall with a deafening bang. I stood up instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh hallway lighting, was Barbara. Her face was flushed a deep mottled purple with uncontrolled rage, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, manic energy. In her fist, she clutched a thick stack of crumpled termination notices. The war had officially arrived at my doorstep. She marched into my apartment without a single shred of hesitation. Her heavy leather boots stomped against my polished hardwood floors, leaving faint scuff marks in their wake. She slammed the door behind her with such immense force that the framed photographs hanging on my entryway wall rattled violently against the plaster. I did not flinch. I simply took another slow sip of my wine and watched the spectacle unfold before me. Barbara was breathing heavily. The thick stack of termination notices in her right hand trembled as she shook them aggressively in my direction. "You vindictive, bitter little witch!" she screamed. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings of my living room, shrill and entirely out of control. "You think you can just snap your fingers and ruin innocent people's livelihoods. You think you can throw my family out on the street because you are petty and jealous." I set my wine glass down on the kitchen island. I made sure my movements were slow and deliberate. It drove her absolutely crazy when I refused to match her manic energy. "No one is ruining innocent lives, Barbara." I replied, my tone steady and completely even. "I am simply taking out the trash." That comment pushed her completely over the edge. She closed the physical distance between us, throwing the crumpled termination notices across the kitchen counter. They scattered over the marble surface like discarded lottery tickets. I glanced down at them. I could see the names of her various relatives printed in bold black ink at the top of each page. There was her cousin, who was supposed to be the head of human resources, but spent most of his time golfing at the country club. There was her nephew, who held the title of regional logistics manager, despite never actually setting foot inside a warehouse. "You are doing this because you are a pathetic failure," she yelled, spit flying from her lips. "You are doing this because my son finally woke up and realized he was married to a cold, calculating spreadsheet of a human being. You are just throwing a massive tantrum because Derek found an upgrade. He found a woman who actually knows how to treat a man. And now you are trying to punish my entire family to get back at him." I looked at the woman who had spent the last 3 years making my life a living nightmare. She really believed her own twisted narrative. She genuinely thought that Derek bringing his mistress into my life and my father business was somehow my fault. "Derek did not find an upgrade," I said calmly. "He found an accomplice." Barbara slammed her hands down on the marble counter. Do not you dare disrespect my son. Do not you dare forget what we did for you. 3 years ago, your father was lying in a hospital bed with tubes down his throat. His heart gave out and his precious logistics company was completely leaderless. Who stepped up, Amber? Who stepped in to save your family legacy when you were too busy crying in the waiting room? She did not wait for me to answer. She just kept projecting her revised version of history. Derek stepped up, she shouted, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. My son worked 80-hour weeks to keep Apex Logistics afloat, and he brought in our family to help. We provided the manpower. We provided the loyalty. When your father was useless, we kept the lights on. My brother stepped in as chief financial officer. My nephews took over the supply chain. We saved your father from bankruptcy. The sheer audacity of her lies was almost impressive. Derek had not stepped up to save anything. He had swooped in like a vulture, recognizing that my father's incapacitation was the perfect opportunity to seize control. And the family members Barbara claimed had kept the lights on were nothing more than parasites. They were 21 individuals who drew massive executive salaries, utilized company expense accounts for personal vacations, and contributed absolutely nothing to the daily operations of Apex Logistics. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the edge of the counter. You did not save the company, Barbara. You orchestrated a hostile takeover using nepotism. Your brother does not even know how to balance a corporate ledger. Your nephews do not know the difference between a freight invoice and a restaurant receipt. You treated my father company like a personal piggy bank for your unemployable relatives. Barbara's face contorted with a mixture of profound hatred and rising panic. She could not handle the reality of the situation. She was so accustomed to steamrolling over me, so used to me backing down to avoid a scene. But the woman she was used to bullying no longer existed. That woman died the moment I discovered Derek was sleeping with his so-called executive assistant while using my father company funds to pay for their luxury hotel suites. You ungrateful brat, she hissed, stepping around the kitchen island to invade my personal space. We built that company into what it is today. Derek expanded the client base. Derek secured the new regional contracts. You and your father would be destitute without us. And you think you can just divorce my son and fire my blood relatives on a Friday afternoon? I did not back away as she approached. I stood my ground, holding her furious gaze. The termination notices are completely legal, Barbara. Your family members were at-will employees. They were terminated for gross incompetence and total failure to fulfill their job duties. They are extremely lucky I am not demanding full restitution for the unearned wages they collected over the past 36 months. Barbara let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Restitution. You really are living in a fantasy world, Amber. You think this little stunt is going to stick. You think my brother is just going to pack up his desk and walk away. You think Derek is going to let you humiliate his mother and his cousins like this. She took another step closer. I could smell the strong floral perfume she always wore. It was suffocating and heavy, just like her dark presence in my life. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. She slammed it down on the counter right next to my wine glass. I am not leaving this apartment until this is fixed, she demanded, her voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. She moved closer, physically cornering me against the kitchen counter. There was nowhere for me to step back without hitting the stove behind me. She placed both of her hands on the counter on either side of me, effectively trapping me in place. Like any cornered animal, she was lashing out with everything she had. Her eyes were wide open and completely devoid of any rational thought. She was a desperate woman, cornered, a furious woman, who finally realized that her luxurious free ride was suddenly coming to a very abrupt and humiliating end. You are going to call your weak, dying father right now, Barbara ordered, her voice laced with absolute venom. She slid the smartphone across the smooth marble surface, pushing it to my hand. You are going to call Richard and tell him this was a massive misunderstanding. You are going to reinstate my family immediately, or I swear to God I will ruin you. I looked down at the device resting on the cool marble surface. The screen was black, reflecting the recessed lighting from my kitchen ceiling. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Barbara breathing heavily through her nose. Her chest heaved with exertion and her eyes darted across my face, searching for the familiar signs of submission she had grown so accustomed to seeing over the past 3 years. She expected my hands to tremble. She expected me to pick up the phone with tears welling in my eyes and dial my father to beg for peace, just to make the screaming stop. Instead, I reached past the phone entirely. I wrapped my fingers around the delicate stem of my wine glass, lifted it to my lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp white wine. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to fill the physical space between us. Then, with a single finger, I casually pushed her smartphone back across the smooth marble counter. It slid with a soft scraping sound, coming to a halt directly in front of her clenched fists. "I am not calling anyone, Barbara," I said, my voice barely above a conversational whisper. "And you are going to leave my apartment before I call building security to have you removed for trespassing." The sheer nonchalance of my refusal hit her like a physical blow. For a split second, she simply stared at me, her brain failing to process the reality that her intimidation tactics were no longer working on the woman she viewed as weak and defeated. Then the shock melted into a primal, vicious rage. She slammed her hands against the counter again, leaning her upper body across the island, as if she wanted to reach over the marble and physically strangle me. She bared her teeth, curling her lips into a nasty snarl that made her look entirely unhinged in the fading afternoon light. "You think this is a game?" she spat, her voice vibrating with a toxic mix of panic and fury. "You think you can just dismiss me like some unruly employee? You have absolutely no idea what you have just done, Amber. You just declared war on the wrong family." She pushed herself back from the counter and began to pace the length of my kitchen, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the floorboards. "If you do not pick up that phone and reverse those terminations right now, I am going to unleash Derek's aggressive legal team on you and your pathetic father. We will drag you through the mud in the divorce asset division. You think you can just walk away cleanly without paying us what we are owed?" Derek built that company while Richard was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to breathing machines. Derek poured his blood, sweat, and tears into Apex Logistics. He modernized your entire outdated supply chain. He secured the regional contracts that your father was too old and tired to negotiate. He is the only reason that company did not go completely bankrupt 3 years ago. She stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. Her eyes were wide with malicious confidence and the absolute certainty that she held the winning hand. "The lawyers are going to tear you apart in family court," she threatened, taking a menacing step forward. "They are going to claim half of Apex Logistics. Derek is legally entitled to 50% of that company for the immense sweat equity he invested during your marriage. He has the emails, he has the client records, he has the operational history to prove he was acting as the chief executive officer while you were busy playing with your little accounting spreadsheets in your home office. By the time my son is done with you in the divorce courts, you will be handing over half the voting shares and paying him executive alimony for the rest of your miserable life." I listened to her entire rant without interrupting a single word. I let her lay out her grand legal strategy, laying bare the absolute delusion that she and Derek had been operating under for the past 36 months. They really believed they had orchestrated the perfect corporate theft. They genuinely thought that marital asset laws would protect their hostile takeover and reward their blatant infidelity and greed. I took another unhurried sip of my wine, savoring the taste as I watched her chest heave with the physical exertion of her screaming. Then I set the glass down gently on the counter, making sure the base made a soft, precise clink against the marble. It was time to pull the rug out from under her feet. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the first psychological blow of the evening. "Derek cannot take half of a company that does not belong to my father anymore," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity and calm conviction. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the sudden quiet of the apartment. Barbara frowned, her perfectly drawn eyebrows knitting together in deep confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound materialized. I did not give her the chance to formulate a coherent response. I kept my gaze locked onto hers, making sure she understood the absolute certainty of my statement. "You and Derek spent the last 3 years treating Apex Logistics like your personal kingdom." I continued, stepping away from the counter and walking slowly around the kitchen island to face her directly without any barriers between us. "You assumed that because my father was recovering from a heart attack, he was oblivious to the parasites draining his life work. You assumed that because I was a quiet, compliant wife, I was inherently stupid. But you made one massive, fatal miscalculation, Barbara. You assumed the company's shares were still structured under my father's individual name, making them highly vulnerable to your son's marital asset claims in a messy divorce. My father quietly stepped down from his position as the majority shareholder. Months ago, I revealed, watching the color slowly begin to drain from her flushed cheeks as the reality of my words began to penetrate her arrogance. He completely restructured the ownership of Apex Logistics long before I ever handed Derek those divorce papers. He transferred the entirety of his corporate holdings out of his personal estate. There is absolutely no company for Derek to claim half of because my father does not technically own it anymore. Your son's aggressive legal team can subpoena all the financial documents they want. They are going to find a massive, impenetrable brick wall that leaves Derek with absolutely nothing. I expected her to scream again. I expected her to throw something across the room or perhaps lunge at me in a fit of blind, desperate rage. I did not expect her to start laughing, but that is exactly what she did. It started as a low, dark chuckle in the back of her throat and quickly escalated into a malicious, grating laugh that echoed unpleasantly through the high ceilings of my living room. She threw her head back, genuinely amused and completely unfazed by the revelation that her son's legal leverage had just been completely obliterated by my father's careful estate planning. "You really think you are so smart, do not you, Amber?" she mocked, shaking her head as if I were a foolish child who had just told a naive and harmless joke. She reached into the pocket of her tailored winter coat and pulled out her own smartphone. Her movements were entirely devoid of the panic I had anticipated. Instead, she moved with the dark, supreme confidence of a predator who already knew the trap had been sprung and the prey was caught. "You think a little clever paperwork is going to stop us from taking what is rightfully ours?" She held her phone up in the air, unlocking the screen with a swift, aggressive swipe of her thumb. She hit a speed dial contact and tapped the speakerphone icon, amplifying the dial tone throughout the quiet apartment. She stared at me, her eyes gleaming with a toxic, triumphant joy that made my skin crawl. "You think your little administrative games matter?" she taunted, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. "Derek is already inside the corporate servers. While you were busy filing your pathetic divorce papers at the courthouse and cutting the payroll, my son was taking actual, undeniable control of the business. He just initiated a total lockdown of the financial infrastructure. He froze all the operating accounts, every single corporate credit card, every vendor payment line, every payroll distribution channel is completely frozen under his exclusive administrative access." The phone in her hand continued to ring, calling her son to confirm the absolute destruction of my family livelihood. Her smile twisted into something truly evil, displaying a complete lack of humanity or any shred of remorse for the lives she was attempting to ruin. "Let us see how long your father's little business lasts with zero cash flow," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Trucks need fuel, drivers need paychecks, warehouses need daily utility payments to keep the lights on and the cargo secure. Without access to those vital operating accounts, Apex Logistics will be completely bankrupt and begging for a buyout before the end of the week." The sharp, rhythmic ringing of the phone on speaker echoed against the kitchen tiles, piercing the tense air of my apartment. With every unanswered ring, Barbara Victoria's smile grew wider. But as I stared at her gloating expression, the sound of the dial tone began to warp and fade in my mind, slowly transforming into the delicate clinking of crystal champagne glasses. The sterile lighting of my modern kitchen dissolved completely, replaced by the warm ambient glow of a massive crystal chandelier. I was transported directly back to a night exactly 6 months ago. It was the evening of the annual Apex Logistics Charity Gala, held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel. That night was the absolute turning point, the moment the blindfold was finally ripped from my eyes, and I saw the toxic ecosystem Derek and Barbara had meticulously constructed. I was not standing confidently in my own kitchen that night. I was seated at table 42, a cramped overflow table pushed so far into the back corner of the ballroom that every time the kitchen doors swung open, my chair was jostled by the hurrying waitstaff. I was wearing a conservative dark blue dress that Barbara had explicitly selected for me, telling me it was crucial not to look too flashy when my father's business was supposedly struggling financially. I sat there in silence, picking at a plate of cold roasted chicken, watching my own husband play the role of the conquering hero. Derek was holding court at the absolute center of the room. He stood at the head table completely in his element, surrounded by our top-tier vendors and primary investors. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that he had charged to the corporate account, laughing loudly and commanding the attention of everyone within a 50-foot radius. He was the golden boy, the charismatic savior, who had generously stepped in to rescue his poor, ailing father-in-law. I watched as he confidently raised his glass to make a toast, taking absolute credit for a record-breaking financial quarter. He spoke passionately about his tireless dedication, his innovative supply chain solutions, and his unparalleled leadership skills. It was a masterful performance completely devoid of any truth. But what truly made my stomach churn that evening was the woman standing right by his side. Her name was Brittany. She was 24 years old, wearing a sleek silver gown that left very little to the imagination. She was officially on the company payroll as a senior executive coordinator, earning a salary that was nearly double what our actual warehouse managers made. She was also one of Barbara's distant cousins, and more importantly, she was Derek's mistress. I watched from the shadows of table 42 as Derek brazenly placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward a group of our most lucrative logistics partners. He smiled his perfect practice smile and introduced her to the crowd as his indispensable right hand. He told the vendors that Apex Logistics simply could not function without her tireless efforts and brilliant organizational skills. Brittany giggled, leaning into his touch and playfully batting her eyelashes at the men in the circle. They were flaunting their affair right out in the open, hiding in plain sight behind the shield of corporate networking. I sat there gripping my linen napkin under the table, feeling a sickening wave of humiliation wash over me. I was the actual daughter of the founder. I was the legal wife. Yet I had been strategically banished to the darkest corner of the room, treated like an embarrassing relative who had to be hidden away from polite society. Meanwhile, the woman sleeping with my husband was being paraded around the ballroom as the brilliant future of my family company. The sheer disrespect was suffocating. I watched Derek and Brittany laugh together, sharing a private joke as they sipped expensive champagne paid for by my father's hard work. The vendors nodded along, completely oblivious to the fact that they were shaking hands with a massive fraud. Derek was selling them a total illusion, and they were buying it without a second thought. I realized then that this was not just a simple case of a cheating husband. This was an organized, systemic takeover. Barbara and Derek had built an entire ecosystem designed to push me out, isolate my father, and drain the company dry. Every single one of the 21 relatives they had planted on the payroll was a willing participant in this elaborate charade. They provided the applause, the validation, and the smokescreen, while Derek pillaged the accounts. I decided I had sat in the dark long enough. I recognized one of our oldest angel investors, a man named Thomas Henderson, standing near the main bar. He had been a close friend of my father for decades, and I knew he would want to know the truth about my father's health and the reality of the company finances. I pushed my chair back from the overflow table, determined to reclaim at least a shred of my dignity. I smoothed down the skirt of my dark dress and began navigating through the sea of tables toward the bar. I kept my eyes locked on Mr. Henderson, hoping to catch his attention before he engaged in another conversation. I was halfway across the ballroom, my heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and renewed resolve. I just needed 5 minutes to speak with him, to bypass the narrative Derek was spinning and advocate for my father's legacy. I was less than 10 feet away from the bar when a hand suddenly shot out from the crowd. Fingers like cold steel talons clamped down violently around my right wrist. The grip was shockingly strong, stopping my forward momentum instantly and jerking my arm backward. I gasped in pain, stumbling slightly in my heels, as I was roughly pulled behind a large decorative floral arrangement near the hallway entrance. I looked up, rubbing my throbbing wrist, to see Barbara glaring at me. She was wearing a heavy emerald green gown, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She did not let go of my wrist. Instead, she dug her manicured nails deeper into my skin, applying enough pressure to ensure a dark purple bruise would blossom there by morning. "Where exactly do you think you are going, Amber?" She hissed, her voice low and threatening, barely audible over the loud music playing from the stage. I tried to pull my arm away, but she stepped closer, using her body weight to pin me against the wall hidden behind the massive arrangement of white orchids. "I am going to speak with Thomas Henderson," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the sharp pain radiating up it. "He is a friend of my father. I want to say hello." Barbara let out a harsh, mocking breath. "You are not going to speak to anyone," she commanded, tightening her grip further. "You are going to turn around, walk back to your little table in the corner, and sit down quietly until this event is over. Derek is conducting highly sensitive business negotiations right now, and the absolute last thing he needs is his depressed, socially awkward wife dragging down the mood and ruining his professional image." The ringing of the phone on the kitchen counter snapped me out of the memory, but I could not answer it just yet. The shrill electronic chime blended with the phantom sounds still echoing in my mind. I stared at the glowing screen of Derek calling his mother, but I was still trapped behind that floral arrangement with Barbara nails digging into my skin. She dragged me out to finish the job. She yanked my arm, forcing me to stumble back into the crowded ballroom. She pulled me directly toward the large circular table where Derek was entertaining the board of investors. The men in expensive suits were laughing loudly at something he had just said. Brittany was still standing right beside him, holding a crystal flute of champagne and smiling like she owned the building. Barbara marched me right up to the edge of their circle. She did not lower her voice or attempt to be discreet. She wanted an audience. "Derek, darling." Barbara called out, her voice slicing through the ambient noise of the ballroom. "I found your wife hiding in the back corner again." The conversation around the table abruptly stopped. Several powerful board members turned to look at me. My wrist was throbbing painfully, and my face felt hot with sudden intense exposure. Derek looked slightly annoyed by the interruption, but quickly masked it with a patronizing smile. He walked over to me, shaking his head, as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "Amber," he sighed loud enough for the entire group of investors to hear. "We talked about this before we left the house. You have to mingle and show your support. You cannot just sulk in the shadows when we are trying to celebrate a record-breaking quarter for your father company." I tried to pull my aching arm away from Barbara, but she held on tight, turning her full attention to the watching investors. "You will have to forgive my daughter-in-law, gentlemen," Barbara announced, projecting her voice so several neighboring tables turned to listen. "Amber struggles immensely with these types of social events. She is much more comfortable hiding at home, obsessed with her little accounting spreadsheets, than she is being a proper supportive wife to a man who is actively saving her family legacy." The sheer calculated cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. She was taking my legitimate profession as a forensic accountant and twisting it into a pathetic, neurotic hobby. She was constructing a public narrative that I was a cold, ungrateful burden dragging him down. Derek played right along. He let out a long, suffering sigh and rubbed the back of his neck, appearing physically exhausted by my presence. "It has been a difficult adjustment," he told the board members, putting on fake sympathy. "While I have been putting in 80-hour weeks to keep Apex Logistics running smoothly, she prefers to sit in her home office isolating herself. I try to get her involved in the operational side, but some women just lack the executive mindset required for this industry. That is exactly why I brought Brittany on board," he continued, gesturing toward his mistress, who offered a fabricated smile. "I needed an assistant who understands the intense demands of modern business. Someone who can keep up while my wife prefers her quiet numbers." The board members shifted uncomfortably. A few of them exchanged amused glances. One older investor, a man who had known my father for 20 years, let out an awkward chuckle. "Well, Derek," he joked, swirling the ice in his glass, "you cannot expect a number cruncher to understand the art of the deal. Keep up the excellent work, son. We know you are carrying an incredibly heavy load right now." A chorus of agreeable murmurs rippled through the influential group. They were buying the lie completely without a single question. They looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and mild disdain, fully accepting the manufactured reality that I was a frigid, inadequate partner holding back their charismatic young chief executive. Barbara finally released my wrist, giving me a slight demeaning shove backward. "Run along back to your table, Amber," she whispered, her tone dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Leave the heavy lifting to the adults." I did not say a single word. I could not. The public humiliation was a massive physical weight crushing the breath entirely out of my lungs. I turned away from the circle of laughing men and the smug, triumphant faces of my husband and his mother. I did not go back to my table. I walked straight out of the ballroom, pushing my way through the heavy doors and stepping into the quiet corridor of the hotel. My vision was blurred with unshed tears of pure, unadulterated outrage. I needed a quiet, isolated place to breathe, to gather my chaotic thoughts, and figure out how to survive the rest of this waking nightmare. I took the service elevator up to the fourth floor. Apex Logistics had rented a temporary administrative suite there for the gala event. My father had a private office set up within the suite intended for him to use if he needed to rest his heart during the long, exhausting evening. Since he was recovering at home, the office was dark. I slipped inside and locked the door behind me, leaning my back against the cool wood and letting out a long, shaky breath. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city traffic far below. I walked over to the desk, intending only to sit in the plush leather chair and wait out the remainder of the charity event in peace. I flicked on the single desk lamp, casting light across the polished surface. My eyes fell upon a stack of operational folders Derek had carelessly left behind. The top folder was boldly labeled Confidential Quarterly Projections. The forensic accountant inside me, the very part of my identity they had just publicly mocked and dismissed, took over my actions. I opened the heavy cardstock folder and began scanning the printed spreadsheets line by line. It took me less than 5 minutes to realize that something was catastrophically wrong with the mathematics. The numbers Derek had been bragging about downstairs were complete fabrications. The revenue columns were massively inflated with projected contracts that had not actually been signed. The expense reports were heavily redacted, manually hiding massive outflows of cash that did not correspond to any known logistical operations or standard vendor payments. I pulled out my phone and used my emergency administrative credentials to log directly into the company backend server. I bypassed Derek's superficial presentation files and dug straight into the raw, unedited general ledger. My heart began to race as the true financial picture of Apex Logistics materialized on the small screen of my phone. The company was not experiencing a record-breaking quarter. It was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming, unsustainable rate. Massive, unauthorized wire transfers were being executed weekly, draining the operational reserves my father had spent 30 years building. I scrolled rapidly through the recent payroll distribution logs and saw the 21 familiar names of Barbara relatives. They were drawing exorbitant executive-level compensation, while the crucial shipping and warehouse maintenance budgets were being systematically slashed to the bone. The company was bleeding to death from 1,000 deliberate calculated cuts, orchestrating a massive theft hiding right in plain sight behind their polished, charming public facade. I knew exactly what I must do now to completely destroy them. The morning after the charity gala, I sat at the large oak dining table in the suburban house Derek and I shared at the time. The bright sun streamed through the windows, creating a deceptively peaceful atmosphere. I had not slept. My mind was consumed by the financial ruin I uncovered on the company's servers the night before. I printed a stack of the most damning payroll ledgers and placed them face down, waiting for my husband to wake up. When Derek finally walked downstairs, he looked incredibly smug. He wore silk pajamas, pouring himself coffee with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. I skipped the morning pleasantries. I waited until he took a sip of coffee before sliding the papers across the table. I asked him directly about the massive discrepancies found in the general ledger. I pointed to the highlighted columns and asked him to explain why 21 of Barbara's relatives were drawing executive compensation. I kept my voice calm, even though my hands were shaking under the table. I told him I worked at Apex Logistics for years and never saw a single one of these cousins inside the building. I asked what they were doing to earn hundreds of thousands of dollars while warehouse maintenance budgets were slashed to the bone. Derek just froze. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. For a second, I saw raw panic flash across his eyes. He realized I had breached his carefully constructed illusion. But Derek was a master manipulator trained by his mother to never admit defeat. The panic vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, aggressive posture. He slammed his mug down hard on the counter, spilling hot coffee across the marble. He did not bother to explain the phantom employees. He went on the offensive, turning the entire situation around on me. He marched over and snatched the papers out of my hand, tearing them in half with a violent motion. He accused me of being completely paranoid and totally unhinged. He raised his voice, shouting that my desperate snooping was a clear sign of severe mental instability. He looked down at me with absolute disgust and told me I was bitterly jealous. He claimed I was jealous of the financial success he brought to my father company and jealous of the capable people helping him run it. He said my obsession with numbers and spreadsheets was destroying our marriage, making me an intolerable, toxic presence. I stood my ground, pushing my chair back and standing up to meet his angry gaze. I refused to let him gaslight me into doubting my own professional expertise. I told him that fake invoices and phantom payroll distributions were not corporate success. I told him it was blatant theft. I looked him dead in the eye and stated clearly that I was leaving the house right that minute to go straight to my father. I was going to show Richard exactly what was happening to his company accounts and expose the massive fraud Derek and Barbara were orchestrating behind his back. That was the exact moment Derek deployed his most despicable and effective weapon. He did not yell or try to physically block the door. Instead, he stepped right up to my face and lowered his voice to a dangerous, chilling whisper. He asked me if I really wanted to be the direct reason my father died. The question hit me like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the breath from my lungs. Derek saw my hesitation and immediately pressed his advantage. He reminded me of the severe, massive heart attack Richard had suffered just a few months prior and the incredibly fragile state of his ongoing physical recovery. Derek's face twisted into a mask of fake, tragic concern. He claimed that my father's medical heart monitor had been showing dangerous, life-threatening arrhythmias all week due to the standard stress of the business. He spun a horrific, incredibly convincing narrative that my toxic negativity and my wild, fabricated accusations would be the exact emotional trigger that caused a fatal cardiac event. Derek told me that Richard trusted him implicitly to handle the heavy burdens of the logistics industry so that Richard could focus entirely on surviving. He stepped closer, backing me against the edge of the dining table. He told me that if I walked into my father's quiet recovery room and started screaming about embezzlement and corporate fraud, the sudden shock and heartbreak would literally kill him on the spot. Derek looked deep into my eyes, his voice dripping with venomous sincerity. He told me that if my father's heart gave out because of my selfish, paranoid need to cause drama, my father's blood would be entirely on my hands for the rest of my miserable life. I felt a cold, paralyzing terror wash over my entire body. My father was the only person in the world who genuinely loved me. The thought of causing him physical harm, the thought of being responsible for a fatal heart attack paralyzed me completely. Derek knew exactly what he was doing. He knew my deep, profound love for Richard was my greatest vulnerability, and he weaponized it with ruthless precision. He watched the fight drain completely out of my posture. He saw my shoulders slump and the tears of helpless frustration gather in my eyes. He smiled a sickening, triumphant smile, knowing he had successfully trapped me in a psychological prison. He told me to go upstairs, calm my crazy nerves, and learn how to be a supportive, grateful wife. He forced me to drop the inquiries entirely to protect my father's failing health. He forced me to swallow the daily disrespect, the blatant infidelity, and the theft of my family legacy because I was too terrified to risk my father's life by exposing the truth. I was forced to suffer in absolute silence, bearing the heavy, agonizing weight of their deception alone. But what Derek did not realize as he walked out of the kitchen that morning was that silencing me did not stop my investigation. It only forced me to change my entire strategy. It forced me to stop looking for a confrontation and start building a silent, bulletproof trap instead. The harsh, rhythmic ringing of a cell phone violently shattered the memory, snapping my consciousness back to the present moment. The warm morning sunlight of my old suburban dining room vanished instantly, replaced by the cool evening shadows of my current downtown apartment. I blinked, focusing my eyes on the scene unfolding directly in front of me. I was no longer the terrified, defeated wife backed against a dining table. I was standing in my own kitchen, completely free from Derek control, holding a glass of crisp white wine. And standing right across from me was Barbara. Her phone was still ringing loudly on the marble island, calling out to her son. The arrogant, triumphant grin on her face was identical to the one Derek had worn the morning he used my father life as a bargaining chip. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated malice, fully believing she was about to deliver the final crushing blow to my family. She thought I was still that same helpless woman she could easily manipulate and destroy. "I is going to bankrupt your family by morning," Barbara taunted, her voice echoing with toxic glee over the sound of the ringing phone. The ringing of the cell phone on the marble island echoed through the quiet kitchen. Barbara stood across from me, radiating toxic confidence. Her eyes were locked onto mine, waiting eagerly for the moment my spirit would break. She wanted to see tears form. She wanted to watch the realization of financial ruin wash over my face. Instead, I stood perfectly still, holding my wine glass and watching the bright screen illuminate the darkening room. The device chimed a fourth time before the line clicked open. A heavy, ragged breath crackled through the small speaker. It did not sound like a man who had just conquered an empire. It sounded like a man who was actively suffocating. "Derek, darling." Barbara purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She leaned closer to the phone, placing both hands flat on the marble surface. "I am standing here right now with your ex-wife. She is throwing quite the little tantrum this evening. I think it is time we put her in her place. Go ahead and confirm it for her. Tell her exactly what you just did to the Apex Logistics operating accounts. Tell her how long her father company has left before it bleeds out." Barbara looked up at me, a cruel, victorious smile stretching across her face. She waited for her son to deliver the killing blow. "Mom," Derek gasped. His voice was incredibly thin, trembling with a raw panic that I had never heard from him before. He sounded entirely broken. "Mom, you need to listen to me. Something is wrong. Something is catastrophically wrong." The victorious smile on Barbara's face faltered just a fraction of an inch. Her perfectly drawn eyebrows pulled together in a slight frown. She leaned closer to the phone, clearly confused by the terror vibrating through the speaker. "What are you talking about, Derek?" she demanded, her tone losing its sweet edge and sharpening into annoyance. "Stop acting so dramatic and just tell her the accounts are frozen. Put the nail in the coffin so we can get out of this miserable situation." "They are frozen!" Derek shouted, the sound of his panic filling the kitchen. He was practically hyperventilating, his breath catching in his throat with every single word. "The corporate accounts are completely locked down. Every single one of them. The payroll lines, the vendor distribution accounts, the emergency reserves. Everything is locked. But I did not do it." The air in my apartment grew incredibly still. Barbara stood frozen, her hands pressed against the marble counter. Her brain was visibly struggling to process the words coming out of her own smartphone. "What do you mean you did not do it?" she asked, her voice dropping into a harsh, urgent whisper. "We discussed this exactly 3 hours ago. You said you were going into the administrative portal to initiate the emergency freeze. I tried," Derek cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. "I logged into the primary backend right after you left for her apartment. I went to initiate the standard security protocol, just like we planned. But the system rejected me. I tried to access the secondary administrative portal, but it kicked me out entirely. Mom, my executive credentials are completely revoked. The system does not even recognize my profile anymore. I am locked out of the entire corporate infrastructure." Barbara's face began to drain of its color. The deep, mottled purple of her previous rage was rapidly replaced by a sickly pale white. She shook her head in denial, picking the phone up off the counter and holding it closer to her mouth. "That is absolutely impossible, Derek," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch as the panic finally began to set in. "You are the acting chief executive. You have master override privileges. Call the banking representative right now. Call Harrison at the commercial branch and tell him there is a glitch in the system. Tell him to manually bypass the digital lock and freeze the assets under your verbal authority. I already called him, Derek sobbed. The sound of a grown man who had tormented me for 3 years openly weeping over the phone was deeply surreal. I called the commercial branch 5 minutes ago. Harrison would not even speak to me. He transferred me directly to the legal compliance department. They said I am no longer an authorized representative of Apex Logistics. Derek hyperventilated. He was pacing wherever he was, his footsteps echoing hollowly through the phone. They said they could not give me any access to the operating funds because a total federal hold was just placed on everything. The bank received a direct legal mandate to freeze every corporate asset pending a massive financial investigation. Mom, the bank fraud division is involved. The federal authorities locked down the accounts. We cannot move a single dime. The silence that followed his confession was absolute and deafening. Barbara stood rigidly in my kitchen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with a profound, consuming horror. She slowly lowered the phone away from her face, staring blankly at the dark marble counter. The magnificent bulletproof illusion she and her son had meticulously maintained for 36 months was actively burning to the ground all around them. They had built their fragile empire on stolen money and fraudulent authority, and now the reality of their crimes was crashing down upon their heads. I stood perfectly still and watched her process the sheer magnitude of the destruction. I watched the arrogant, entitled woman who had kicked down my front door suddenly realize that she was no longer the predator in the room. She was the prey, and the trap had already snapped violently shut around them. I did not rush the moment. I allowed the heavy, suffocating panic to fully settle over her shoulders. Then I moved. I stepped away from the kitchen island and walked slowly toward the refrigerator. My movements were calm, relaxed, and entirely unbothered by the frantic sobbing coming from the speakerphone. I slowly opened the refrigerator door, successfully retrieving the freshly chilled bottle of white wine. I walked back to the counter, retrieved my glass, and deliberately poured myself a fresh serving. The soft trickling sound of the wine filling the crystal glass seemed incredibly loud in the devastated silence of the apartment. Barbara slowly lifted her head. She stared at me as if she was looking at a ghost. The smug, arrogant smile was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She finally understood that I was not the weak, depressed victim she had spent years trying to cultivate. She finally saw the meticulous forensic accountant who had silently and efficiently dismantled her entire life. I set the wine bottle down on the counter. I picked up my glass and took a slow, appreciative sip, maintaining direct, unbroken eye contact with the woman who had made my father's life a living hell. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool marble surface. Derek was still rambling on the other end. "What are we going to do now, Mom?" he begged her desperately. I leaned my head down, speaking directly into the small microphone at the base of the device. My voice was smooth, conversational, and completely devoid of any sympathy. "Looking for the specific offshore banking routing numbers, Derek," I asked, allowing a small, razor-sharp smile to touch the deep corners of my mouth. "I already found them." The silence that poured through the speakerphone was absolute and heavy. I could actually hear the sharp intake of Derek catching his breath 1,000 miles away, or perhaps just across downtown Denver. He was completely paralyzed. Barbara stood directly across from me, the marble island separating us like a physical barricade. Her eyes darted wildly around the kitchen, as if searching for a hidden camera or a teleprompter. She was desperately trying to process how the quiet, submissive wife she had spent 3 years tormenting suddenly possessed the highly encrypted financial coordinates of her secret offshore sanctuary. I did not let the silence stretch out too long. I set my wine glass down and folded my arms across my chest. I stared directly into her panicked eyes, refusing to let her look away. "I memorized the digits weeks ago, Barbara." I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I recited the exact 9-digit tax identification number of the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. I spoke each number slowly and deliberately, letting the reality of my words crash down upon her shoulders. That specific corporate entity is registered to a post office box in Georgetown, but the primary beneficiary is listed under your maiden name. Barbara stumbled backward a single step. The heel of her heavy leather boot caught slightly on the hardwood floor. She gripped the edge of the marble counter to steady herself. Her mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish pulled suddenly out of the water. "You really thought you were operating in the shadows," I said, pushing forward with my explanation. "You thought that just because I stayed home and kept my mouth shut during your elaborate family dinners, I was oblivious to the massive financial bleeding happening right under my nose. You both forgot one very important crucial detail about my life before I married into your toxic chaos. I am not just a jealous ex-wife acting on a hunch. I am a fully licensed bonded forensic accountant. I spent my entire 20s tracking down hidden assets for federal bankruptcy courts. Finding your sloppy amateur digital footprints was practically a vacation for me." Derek finally found his voice on the other end of the line. It was shaking violently. "What did you do, Amber?" he demanded, his tone a mixture of rage and sheer terror. "What exactly did you do to the servers?" I smiled, feeling the immense weight of the past 3 years completely evaporate. "I did not do anything destructive, Derek. I simply observed. While you were busy taking your mistress on expensive weekend trips to luxury resorts, under the guise of attending logistics conferences, I was working. While Barbara was planning the total hostile takeover of my family legacy, picking out the corner office she wanted to claim for herself, I was sitting in the dark glow of my home laptop. For the last 8 months, I quietly, carefully mirrored the entire Apex Logistics backend server. Every single email, every deleted file, every modified vendor contract was copied directly onto an encrypted external drive sitting on my desk. "That is illegal," Derek shouted, his voice cracking. "That is corporate espionage. You cannot just steal private company data. It is not stealing when you are auditing your own family business," I corrected him smoothly. "And it is certainly not corporate espionage to document a massive coordinated embezzlement ring operating within the company walls. I watched you build your little parasitic empire month after month. I systematically mapped out exactly how you did it." Barbara finally found her voice. "You are lying," she spat, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. "We did not embezzle anything. My family worked hard for their salaries." "Your family did not work at all, Barbara." I shot back, my voice echoing sharply in the kitchen. "I laid it all out for them, dismantling their illusion piece by piece. The 21 employees you planted across the logistics network were not just lazy, incompetent hires collecting unearned paychecks. They were strategically positioned ghost vendors. Derek used their administrative credentials to bypass the standard accounting audits. He forged hundreds of commercial shipping invoices for massive freight deliveries that never existed. He created a closed-loop system authorizing payments to fake transport companies and approving the distributions himself. Derek let out a choked, desperate sound over the phone. He knew I had the exact methodology. He knew the paper trail was completely exposed. "You thought you were so brilliant, hiding the cash flow drainage by slashing the warehouse maintenance budgets and cutting driver overtime." I continued, my tone relentless. "You blamed the missing revenue on standard economic inflation and rising fuel costs. You presented falsified quarterly reports to the board of investors, padding the operational numbers while secretly bleeding the core accounts dry. You created a massive, devastating financial sinkhole in the center of my father life work." "You have no proof," Barbara yelled, slamming her hand against the marble island. She was shaking visibly, her facade of power crumbling into dust. "You are just a bitter woman making up stories. No one is going to believe a word you say without concrete physical evidence." "I have 8 months of mirrored server data," I reminded her coldly. "I have the IP addresses proving Derek logged into the accounting software from his hotel room in Chicago while he was supposedly entertaining clients. I have the original, unaltered expense reports before he manually redacted the outbound wire transfers. But more importantly, I have the final destination of every single stolen dollar." I walked slowly around the kitchen island, closing the physical distance between Barbara and myself. I looked down at the phone sitting on the counter. "You see, Derek," I said, speaking clearly into the microphone. "I knew exactly how much you were stealing, but I needed to know where you were hiding it. I knew you were too arrogant to keep it in a domestic account, where the IRS might eventually notice the sudden massive accumulation of wealth. You wanted a secure hidden fortress to hold your stolen treasure until my father passed away, and you could completely liquidate Apex Logistics. I paused, letting the tension build in the room. I watched Barbara's eyes dart nervously toward the front door as if she was contemplating making a run for it. But there was nowhere left for her to run. It took me 3 months to trace the digital laundering process. I revealed, my voice dropping into a dark, satisfied register. You ran the stolen cash through 4 different domestic shell companies. You used fake consulting fees and bogus software licensing agreements to wash the money clean. But every single dollar eventually funneled out of the country. It did not go into a private trust fund for Derek. It did not go into a joint marital account. I looked up from the phone and stared directly into Barbara's terrified eyes. It went to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, I stated with absolute finality. A corporation fully owned and operated exclusively by Barbara. The silence that followed was deafening. The truth hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I had found the stolen money, and I had traced it directly to the matriarch who had orchestrated the entire destruction of my family. She had used her own son as a pawn to execute the fraud, ensuring she held the ultimate control over the illicit funds. The grand illusion was over. Their untouchable empire was completely exposed. Every single lie they had told to my father, every humiliation they had subjected me to, was now weaponized against them. The beautiful, carefully constructed walls of their kingdom were caving in, and there was absolutely no escape from the devastating consequences that were right now rapidly approaching them. The dead silence on the phone was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I could picture Derek standing in whatever dark corner he had retreated to, his mind short-circuiting as the ultimate reality of his situation crashed down on his head. I did not just find the offshore routing numbers. I memorized the primary account passcodes. I forwarded the entire transactional history directly to a federal investigator I had been quietly collaborating with for the past 2 months. The government already has the wire transfer logs, Derek. They already have the time-stamped digital signatures proving you authorized the theft. Barbara let out a sudden guttural scream of pure rage. She lunged forward across the marble kitchen island, her manicured hands grasping wildly at the air in front of my face. I stepped back smoothly, completely out of her physical reach. She hit the edge of the counter hard, her heavy emerald necklace swinging wildly against her chest. "You arrogant little witch!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with the strain of her panic. "You think this changes anything? You think finding a bank account magically erases everything my son contributed during your marriage?" Derek seemed to find a sudden burst of desperate courage through the speakerphone. His frantic energy fueled his own delusion. "Mom is right," he yelled, his voice bouncing erratically off the kitchen walls. "You are completely delusional, Amber. We are still legally married. Every single asset we acquired during the last 3 years is marital property. The courts are going to split everything right down the absolute middle. You can wave your little forensic accounting spreadsheets around all you want, but the family court judge is going to award me exactly half of Apex Logistics. I built that operational infrastructure. I generated the client revenue. The lawyers will drag your father through years of agonizing depositions until he surrenders half the voting shares just to make the nightmare stop. I listened to his desperate, pathetic threats, and I could not hold it back any longer. I tilted my head back and I laughed. It was not a polite, quiet chuckle. It was a loud, genuine laugh of absolute supreme victory. It echoed brightly through the apartment, completely overpowering the toxic venom they were stared at me, as if I had suddenly grown a second head. She was so deeply conditioned to see me cower and apologize that the sound of my genuine laughter completely short-circuited her aggressive momentum. "Stop laughing," she demanded, slamming her fist against the marble. "There is absolutely nothing funny about asset division in a hostile divorce." "Oh, Barbara, there is something incredibly funny about it," I replied, wiping a small tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. I took another slow sip of my wine, setting the glass down and resting my hands on my hips. "The funniest part of this entire situation is that you and Derek actually thought I was just sitting around the house waiting for the inevitable. You honestly believed that I would uncover a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement ring and then just blindly walk into a standard divorce court hoping for the best. I looked down at the phone, making sure my voice carried clearly to Derek. Did you really think I was just going to hand you half of my family legacy on a silver platter, Derek? I asked, my tone dropping into a sharp, dangerous register. Did you think I was going to risk letting a family court judge carve up my father's life work just to appease your aggressive legal team? I did not wait for his answer. I wanted to lay out the exact sequence of events that had permanently sealed his fate. The very night I discovered your little ghost vendor operation on the company servers, I did not pack a bag and confront you. I did not scream or cry or demand a messy public divorce. Instead, I quietly copied the encrypted drive I put on my coat, and I drove straight to my father's house in the middle of the night. Barbara's face turned a sickening shade of chalk white. She knew exactly how close she and Derek had been to my father during his recovery. The thought of me slipping past their careful surveillance to deliver the truth directly to the source made her visibly tremble. I sat down at my father's kitchen table, and I showed him everything I revealed, painting the picture for them with slow, deliberate strokes. I showed him the fake freight invoices. I showed him the slashed maintenance budgets. I showed him the offshore routing numbers, leading directly to your mother Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. I watched a man who had dedicated 30 years of his life to building an honest, reputable business realize that his own son-in-law was a common thief. I watched my father heartbreak Derek, and then I watched that heartbreak instantly transform into cold, calculated fury. My father did not suffer another heart attack like you predicted. Finding out you were bleeding his company dry did not kill him. It cured him of the ridiculous illusion that you were a capable businessman. It gave him the absolute unyielding focus he needed to protect his legacy from the parasites who had infected it. Derek was breathing heavily on the phone. What did Richard do? Amber, he demanded, his voice trembling with a new, distinct flavor of terror. Tell me exactly what he did. I did what any intelligent, ruthless founder would do when faced with a hostile internal threat, I answered smoothly, crossing my arms and savoring the absolute destruction of their plans. He immediately called in the most aggressive estate attorneys in the entire state of Colorado. We did not go to the police right away because we knew a standard criminal investigation could take months to freeze the assets. We needed to surgically remove your access to the company equity before I filed the divorce papers. We needed to make absolutely certain that the business was completely legally shielded from any marital asset claims you might attempt to leverage in court. I paused, letting the anticipation hang thick and heavy in the room. My father did not just quietly step down from his position as the majority shareholder, I explained, watching Barbara's eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated horror. He did not just retire and leave the company assets vulnerable to a hostile divorce settlement. 3 months ago, my father completely liquidated his personal ownership of Apex Logistics. He transferred 100% of the company voting shares and all associated operational assets into a bulletproof premarital irrevocable trust. Barbara let out a sharp choking sound, clutching her chest as the reality of my words hit her. I did not just name me as a passive beneficiary. I continued, my voice rising with absolute, undeniable authority. He made me the sole exclusive trustee and the absolute legal owner of the entire corporate entity. The trust was lawfully established 3 months before I filed for divorce, using shares that had always belonged exclusively to Richard and had never formed part of our marital estate. Because it is an irrevocable trust held entirely outside of my personal marital estate, it is completely insulated from any divorce proceedings. I leaned directly over the cell phone, ensuring my voice carried the full, devastating weight of my victory. Derek cannot claim half of the company in the divorce settlement because I do not technically own it as a marital asset. The trust owns it, and I own the trust. You spent 3 years stealing crumbs from the operational accounts while I legally secured the entire vault. You have absolutely zero leverage. You have zero equity. You have no corporate standing, and you have no legal pathway to force a buyout. You are holding a completely empty hand. The silence that followed was broken by a sudden violent scream from the speakerphone. Derek completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. "That is illegal!" he shrieked, his voice tearing through the speaker with a raw, animalistic panic. You cannot just secretly transfer a multi-million-dollar corporation into a hidden trust right before a divorce. That is fraudulent conveyance, Amber. It is a blatant, deliberate attempt to hide marital assets from the courts. You and Richard broke the law to steal my sweat equity. I was hyperventilating now, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate, frantic flood of rage. I am going to call my lawyers right now. I am going to hire the most vicious litigators in the entire country. We will petition the federal courts to tear that irrevocable trust to shreds. We will subpoena every single document your father signed. You think you are so smart, but you just committed massive financial fraud. I will sue you into the ground, Amber. I will sue your sick father until he is living on the street. I will burn that entire logistics company to the ground before I let you walk away with my half of the empire. I will spend every last dime I have to drag your name through the mud. You are going to regret the day you ever crossed my family. I am going to destroy your entire life and make sure you have absolutely nothing left. The echo of his screaming threat rattled through the smartphone speaker, vibrating against the cool marble surface. He was panting heavily, a cornered animal thrashing against the certainty of his sudden demise. He could not comprehend that his entire parasitic lifestyle was coming to a brutal, permanent end. Before he could launch into another breathless tirade, the dynamic in my apartment abruptly shifted. Barbara had been listening to her unravel, and the sheer, undeniable terror in his voice finally shattered the last fragments of her denial. She realized I was not bluffing. She recognized that the irrevocable trust was entirely real, the federal bank hold was destroying their cash flow, and the forged documents were sitting safely in the hands of federal investigators. Her primal panic morphed into something entirely different. Her fierce survival instinct kicked in. She snatched the smartphone off the counter and hit the red button, instantly cutting off Derek, frantic, screaming, and plunging the apartment back into a suffocating silence. She took a long, deep breath, closing her eyes for a brief second to compose herself. When she opened them, the blind, manic rage that had fueled her home invasion was completely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating manipulation that allowed her to infiltrate my family and exploit my dying father. She stood up straighter, pulling her shoulders back and smoothing down the front of her emerald coat. She looked at me with a sickeningly calm expression, attempting to regain the upper hand through psychological warfare. She recognized that shouting and physical intimidation were utterly useless against me now. If she wanted to survive the trap I had sprung, she needed to pivot to a different strategy, leveraging the only weapon she believed she still controlled. She walked slowly around the kitchen island, pacing with measured steps that echoed softly against the hardwood floor, projecting a false aura of absolute confidence. "You really think you have thought of everything?" "Do not you, Amber," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerously reasonable tone. "You think that just because you tricked your sick father into signing trust documents, you automatically hold all the power. But a company is vastly more than just a collection of legal paperwork filed away in some dusty office. A successful corporation relies entirely on investor confidence, on operational stability, and on an impeccable public reputation. You can hold all the legal voting shares in the world, but if the primary investors pull their funding, the entire logistics network will collapse overnight. Apex Logistics relies heavily on the continued financial backing of some of the most wealthy, influential men in Denver. Those men do not care about your domestic grievances. They care about one thing and one thing only. They care about their massive quarterly returns. She stopped pacing and leaned casually against the counter, a dark, sinister smile slowly returning to her face. She reminded me that Derek had spent the last 3 years building incredibly strong personal relationships with the entire board of directors. He was the charismatic face of Apex Logistics. He was the confident, dynamic leader the investors trusted implicitly to secure their wealth. He drank scotch with them at the country club. He played golf with them every single weekend. He had masterfully cultivated an image of absolute corporate brilliance. Those powerful men viewed Derek as a younger version of themselves. She boasted, her eyes gleaming with toxic pride. They respect him. They listen to him. They view you as nothing more than Richard's quiet, socially awkward daughter, who was lucky enough to marry a man capable of carrying your family legacy. If you try to push my son out, those investors will absolutely revolt. Barbara took a step closer to me, her voice dripping with venomous manipulation. We are going to spin a flawless narrative, she promised softly. We are going to tell the board of directors that you are a deeply disturbed, unstable woman who simply could not handle being replaced by a younger, prettier woman. We will claim that you fabricated these ridiculous embezzlement charges and manipulated the corporate servers out of sheer bitter jealousy. We will paint you as a vindictive, hysterical ex-wife who is actively trying to destroy a highly profitable enterprise just to punish the husband who no longer wanted you. Who do you think those seasoned investors are going to believe, Amber? Are they going to believe the quiet, invisible accountant or the successful chief executive? She did not wait for my answer. I am calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, she demanded, her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. I am going to call every single major investor tonight and summon them to the corporate boardroom at Apex Logistics. Derek is going to bring his polished operational metrics and his undeniable charm. He is going to stand at the head of that table and reassure the board that the company is perfectly safe in his capable hands. He will present your server audit as the desperate, fabricated revenge plot of a woman losing her grip on reality. He will convince them that allowing you to retain any administrative control is a massive risk to their continued prosperity. They will demand immediate action to protect their investments. Barbara continued, her eyes wide with malicious excitement. They will force a swift, brutal vote of no confidence against you and your father. They will leverage the sudden investor panic to mandate a complete structural reorganization of the company leadership. They will permanently install Derek as the rightful chief executive officer, granting him total autonomous control over the entire logistics network. They will completely strip you of your authority, regardless of whatever clever trust document you think you hold. You thought you could trap us in a legal corner, but you completely forgot that perception is reality in the corporate world. We control the narrative, Amber. We control the relationships. And by tomorrow afternoon, we will have total, absolute control of your family company. She grabbed her expensive designer handbag from the counter, slinging it over her shoulder with an air of absolute arrogant finality. She promised that by this time tomorrow, I would be practically begging them on my hands and knees to take the company off my hands, just to stop the catastrophic public embarrassment. She walked confidently toward my shattered front door, her heavy leather boots crunching loudly over the broken wood and glass scattered across the entryway floor. She paused right at the damaged threshold, turning back to look at me one last time. Her eyes were burning with a toxic, triumphant malice, completely certain she had outmaneuvered my master plan. "We will see you at 9 in the morning," she spat, her voice dripping with venomous, aggressive confidence. She turned and slammed her way out of the apartment, leaving me standing entirely alone in the very quiet space. I stood perfectly still in my own kitchen, listening to her heavy footsteps echo and fade down the long hallway. The shattered doorframe stood as a permanent physical testament to her incredibly desperate, unhinged fury. I did not look scared. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or panic anywhere in my body. I slowly lifted my crystal wine glass and took a deeply satisfying sip, savoring the incredibly sweet taste of ultimate victory. I looked exactly like a quiet, patient predator who was happily watching her oblivious, ignorant prey walk directly into a perfectly designed, inescapable cage. The apartment remained silent for several seconds after Barbara disappeared down the hallway. I listened until the last strike of her boots vanished inside the elevator. Only then did I set down my wine glass and look at the wreckage. The broken door hung crooked from one hinge. Splintered wood covered the entryway. Cold evening air moved through the opening and carried the sounds of Denver traffic into what had been my private sanctuary. I did not waste time feeling violated. I treated the scene the same way I treated a compromised financial system. First, I preserved the evidence. I photographed the damaged frame, the shattered lock, the termination notices Barbara had thrown across my counter, and the marks her boots had left on the floor. Then I called building security and instructed them to preserve every second of hallway and elevator footage from the moment she entered the building. The security supervisor arrived with 2 guards less than 5 minutes later. He stared at the destroyed door and asked whether I wanted the police called. I told him a report was already being prepared and that the footage could not be copied, altered, or released to anyone except law enforcement. Barbara had not simply shouted at me. She had forced her way into a secured residence, threatened my father, and attempted to coerce me into reversing lawful corporate decisions. Her tantrum had given me another layer of evidence proving how far she would go when her access to stolen money was threatened. While maintenance installed a temporary steel brace across the door, I carried my laptop back to the kitchen island and opened the encrypted case file I had built over 8 months. The folders were arranged with the precision Derek had always mocked. Phantom payroll, false freight invoices, vendor shells, offshore transfers, administrative access logs. Each category contained the original file, the altered version, the timestamp, and an explanation simple enough for any investor to understand. My phone rang. It was my father. Richard did not ask whether Barbara had come to my apartment. Building security had called the emergency contact listed on my lease. His voice was stronger than it had been in months, but I could hear anger tightening every word. "Are you hurt, Amber?" "No, Dad." The door took more damage than I did. I heard him exhale. Then his tone changed from frightened father to the founder who had built Apex Logistics through 3 recessions and countless supply crises. "Barbara scheduled the board meeting," he said. "3 investors have already called me. Derek told them you suffered a breakdown after the divorce and seized the company systems." "Good," I replied. "That means they are coming." Richard was silent for a moment. He understood immediately. The meeting was not an obstacle. It was the one room where every lie could be destroyed at the same time. He offered to attend, but I refused. Derek had spent years using my father's health as a weapon. I would not give him one more opportunity to provoke Richard in public or claim that I had forced a sick man into a corporate battle. Richard's role was complete. He had signed the lawful restructuring documents, removed Derek's authority, and placed the company beyond the reach of the divorce. Tomorrow belonged to me. I asked him to contact the estate attorneys and have certified copies of the trust, the board resolutions, and the ownership records delivered before 8 in the morning. I also asked for a written statement confirming that Derek had never been appointed chief executive officer, never received equity, and never held authority to transfer company assets. For 3 years, Derek had relied on perception. I was going to answer perception with dates, signatures, and independent verification. My next call was to the federal investigator who had been reviewing the mirrored server data for 2 months. I told him Barbara had confirmed the emergency board meeting and that Derek intended to present an extortion agreement, demanding half of the voting control in exchange for silence. The investigator asked whether I believed Derek would bring the documents into the building. "He already showed me the strategy through his mother," I said. "His ego will make him put it in writing." The investigator instructed me not to provoke a physical confrontation and confirmed that his team would remain nearby until I gave the agreed signal. The federal hold would stay in place, but legitimate payroll, fuel, and critical warehouse expenses had been moved into a supervised continuity channel controlled by the bank's compliance division. Derek believed the freeze would suffocate Apex Logistics. In reality, it only prevented him and Barbara from moving another dollar, while the honest employees kept the company operating. That detail mattered. I did not want to win a boardroom performance while trucks sat without fuel and hundreds of innocent workers wondered whether their paychecks would clear. Before midnight, I held a secure video call with the legitimate operations director, the head of fleet maintenance, and the senior warehouse manager. I told them only what they needed to know. Unauthorized executives had been removed. The company was under a protected financial review. Essential operations would continue. No employee was to confront Barbara's relatives, and no one was to allow them access to a terminal file room vehicle or company device. The operations director looked stunned when I introduced myself as the controlling trustee, but he recovered quickly. He had spent 3 years watching maintenance requests denied, while Barbara's relatives charged luxury meals to the company. He promised the real managers would keep every route moving. After the call, I created 2 board packets. The first contained the fraud evidence, forged invoices, false vendors, wire transfers, access logs, and the direct trail to the Cayman Islands Corporation. The second contained the rescue plan. It showed the investors that removing Derek would not destroy Apex Logistics. It would stabilize it. I included a 90-day cash preservation schedule, an independent audit timetable, temporary leadership assignments for experienced employees, and a process for reviewing every contract Derek had touched. Derek expected me to enter the boardroom as an angry ex-wife carrying accusations. I intended to enter as the only person in the building with both proof of the crime and a credible plan for the morning after. At 2 in the morning, the repair crew finished securing my apartment. I stood alone at the window, looking across the dark Denver skyline. Somewhere in the city, Derek and Barbara were calling investors, rehearsing lies, and convincing themselves that charm could defeat evidence. They believed the emergency meeting would restore their power. They did not understand that every person they summoned would become a witness. I closed the laptop and placed the encrypted drive inside my briefcase. Beside it, I placed the certified trust documents, the continuity plan, the termination records, and an audio recorder synchronized with my phone. Then I sent one final message to the investigator confirming the meeting time. 9 in the morning. Wait for my signal. I slept for less than 3 hours, but I woke without exhaustion. By 7, I was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with my hair pulled back and every document arranged in exact order. I looked once at the damaged front door before leaving. Barbara had intended the destruction as a warning. To me, it was another exhibit. When the elevator doors closed, I felt no fear. The divorce had severed the last legal tie. The trust had secured the company. The bank had secured the money. The federal investigators had secured the evidence. All that remained was to let Derek and Barbara stand before the people they had deceived and confidently explain their own way into the trap. The morning sun rose over the Denver skyline, casting shadows across the concrete of the Apex Logistics campus. I arrived at exactly 8, pulling my car into the parking garage with the calm precision I applied to my life. I stepped out, adjusting the collar of my tailored charcoal suit. I carried only a single slim leather briefcase. I walked through the heavy glass double doors of the main entrance and stepped directly into a highly orchestrated circus. The expansive main lobby of the corporate headquarters was buzzing with a chaotic, toxic energy. Derek and Barbara were already there, standing near the central reception desk, like a pair of victorious generals surveying their troops. Spread out across the polished tile floor were the 21 relatives they had successfully planted on my father's payroll. The cousins, the nephews, the family friends who had never worked an honest day were gathered in a tight, angry cluster. They cast openly hostile glares in my direction the moment I walked through the doors. Barbara was standing in the center of the group, wearing a bright crimson blazer and speaking loudly enough for every legitimate employee in the building to hear. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She gestured wildly with her hands, loudly proclaiming to the gathered crowd that the crazy ex-wife had finally lost her mind completely. She spun a tragic, fabricated story about how I was having a massive nervous breakdown over the divorce. She told the crowded lobby that I was desperately trying to ruin the company out of sheer bitter jealousy. The 21 planted relatives nodded in aggressive agreement, feeding off her toxic energy. They muttered insults, fully believing they were the untouchable victims of a hysterical, jealous woman. Derek stood beside his mother, playing the exhausted patient executive, dealing with an unstable former partner. He wore a sharp navy suit, projecting a manufactured aura of corporate dominance. When he saw me, his fake sympathetic expression instantly hardened into a look of cold, arrogant malice. He broke away from the crowd of angry relatives and marched directly toward me. His heavy footsteps echoed sharply across the lobby floor. He grabbed my upper arm with a punishing grip and steered me away from the reception area. He pulled me down a quiet side corridor and shoved me into a small, vacant conference room, clicking the door shut and locking it behind us. The heavy soundproofing of the room instantly cut off the angry murmurs, plunging us into a tense, suffocating silence. Derek turned to face me, his chest puffed out with absolute unearned superiority. He looked me up and down with a sneer of profound disgust. "You really thought you could just waltz in here and take over my company?" he demanded, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You thought I would just roll over and surrender everything I built?" I stood perfectly still, holding my leather briefcase loosely at my side. I did not speak. I let him fill the quiet room with his desperate, arrogant bluster. He walked over to the conference table and slammed a stack of legal documents onto the wood surface. The papers hit the table with a sharp crack. "My mother and I had a long, strategic conversation with our legal team last night," he boasted, leaning over the table and glaring at me. "We know exactly what you are trying to do, Amber. You are trying to steal the sweat equity I poured into this logistics network. But we are not going to let you destroy this family empire." He tapped a heavy finger against the top page of the legal stack. He outlined his ultimatum with the smug certainty of a man who believed he held the winning cards. "You are going to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement right here and right now," he ordered, leaving zero room for debate. "You are going to permanently seal those fabricated server audits. You are going to reinstate every single one of the 21 employees you wrongfully terminated yesterday afternoon." I took a step closer, invading my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. "And then you are going to sign over 50% of the voting shares of that irrevocable trust directly to me," he demanded. "You are going to legally recognize me as the equal co-owner of Apex Logistics." I looked down at the stack of papers and then back up at his arrogant face. "And what happens if I refuse your generous offer?" I asked, my voice quiet and carefully measured. Derek let out a harsh, cruel laugh. "If you refuse to sign these papers right now, I am going to walk out of this side office and go straight into the executive boardroom," he threatened, pointing toward the hallway. "The primary investors are already arriving. My mother is greeting them right now. I am going to stand in front of that board of directors, and I am going to destroy your father's legacy. I will tell them that Richard was entirely complicit in hiding massive corporate liabilities to cover up his gross incompetence." He stepped even closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous, menacing whisper. "I will drag your professional reputation through the mud, Amber. I will make sure every forensic accounting firm knows you are a vindictive, unstable liar who falsifies data. I will force a massive public vote of no confidence. The investors will panic. They will pull their funding immediately, and Apex Logistics will be bankrupt before lunchtime." He crossed his arms, staring at me with a sickening, triumphant smile. "The choice is yours. You can walk away with half a company, or you can walk away with absolutely nothing at all." I stood in the quiet conference room, processing the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He genuinely believed his threats carried weight. He honestly thought his relationship with the investors was strong enough to override hard empirical financial evidence. He was so completely blinded by his towering ego and his mother-toxic manipulation that he could not see the legal trap waiting just a few feet away. I knew exactly how I needed to play this crucial moment. I needed him to walk into that boardroom feeling like an invincible king. I needed him to be so bloated with false confidence that the inevitable fall would shatter his reality completely. I slowly lowered my gaze to the carpeted floor. I let my posture crumble just a fraction of an inch, allowing my shoulders to slump forward in a display of profound defeat. I took a short, shaky breath, making sure it sounded like I was struggling to hold back a rising tide of panic. I let my hands tremble slightly against the handle of my leather briefcase. I played the role of the broken, terrified wife to absolute perfection. Derek watched my physical reaction, and his smile grew wider. He believed he had finally broken my spirit entirely. He reached out and grabbed the fountain pen resting on the conference table, shoving it aggressively toward my trembling hand. I was completely oblivious to the fact that my shaking was not born from fear. It was the physical manifestation of trying to suppress a massive, overwhelming wave of pure dark amusement. I looked down at the floor, my shoulders shaking rhythmically, appearing to be on the verge of a total emotional breakdown. I forced a ragged gasp into my lungs, making it sound like I was suddenly struggling to draw enough oxygen into my chest. I took a clumsy step backward, allowing the heel of my shoe to catch slightly on the thick carpet. I wrapped my arms tightly around my own waist, adopting a highly defensive, protective posture that practically screamed vulnerability and defeat. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper, ensuring the sound was barely audible, but loud enough to reach his ears in the suffocating silence of the small room. Derek took the bait instantly. He thrived on weakness, and my meticulously crafted display of profound emotional distress fed directly into his most toxic narcissistic tendencies. I took a predatory step forward, closing the physical distance between us with the arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed he had completely dominated his opponent. "Please, Derek," I pleaded, my voice trembling violently as I looked up at him through a sheen of carefully manufactured tears. "You cannot do this to my father. You cannot drag his name into a public scandal. He built this company from nothing. He poured his entire life into making Apex Logistics a respected name in this city. If you go out into that boardroom and tell those investors that he was hiding liabilities, it will absolutely destroy him. The sudden shock and the extreme stress of a massive public humiliation like that will kill him." I pressed the palms of my hands against my cheeks, letting a single tear spill over my lower lash line and track slowly down my face. I needed him to believe that I was entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of my father losing his legacy. I knew exactly which buttons to push to inflate his ego to its absolute maximum capacity. I needed him to feel like a merciful king deciding the ultimate fate of a desperate peasant. "If I sign these papers," I begged, lowering my voice to a frantic, desperate whisper, "if I give you the 50% voting share and sign the non-disclosure agreement right now, will you promise to leave my father out of this? Will you give me your absolute word that you will not mention him to the press or the board of directors? If I surrender the company to you, will you just let him retire in peace and keep his dignity intact?" Derek stared down at me, his eyes practically glowing with dark, triumphant satisfaction. I was literally vibrating with the immense thrill of his perceived victory. He looked at my tear-stained face and my trembling hands, and he saw exactly what he had always wanted to see. He saw a broken, submissive woman begging for mercy at his feet. He let out a deep, booming laugh that bounced harshly off the soundproof walls of the conference room. "You see, Amber, this is exactly why you were never suited for the brutal reality of the corporate world," he mocked, his tone dripping with thick, heavy condescension. "You are far too emotional. You let your personal feelings cloud your business judgment. You are standing here crying over your father's fragile reputation when you should be calculating profit margins and leveraging operational assets. You are weak. You have always been incredibly weak." He leaned against the edge of the conference table, crossing his arms over his chest and looking down at his expensive leather shoes before bringing his arrogant gaze back to my face. "You should have just stayed in the kitchen where you belong," he sneered, delivering the ultimate insult with a sickening smirk. "You should have just focused on being a good, quiet, supportive wife. If you had just stayed in your lane and let me handle the heavy lifting, none of this ugly, unpleasant business would be happening right now. But you had to go and play detective. You had to try and be the smart, independent career woman. And look exactly where that pathetic little rebellion got you. It got you cornered in a side office begging your husband to spare your dying father from total public ruin." Uncrossed his arms and picked up the heavy gold-plated fountain pen resting on top of the legal documents. He rolled it slowly between his fingers, savoring the exquisite power he believed he held over my entire future. He was thoroughly enjoying every single second of this interaction, completely unaware that his grand victorious monologue was giving me the exact leverage I needed to completely destroy him. "I will make you a deal, Amber," he offered, his voice dripping with fake benevolent mercy. "You sign every single page of this contract right now, you sign over the voting shares, and you reinstate my family on the company payroll by 9 o'clock. If you do exactly as you are told without making another sound, I will walk into that boardroom and tell the investors that Richard's retirement was a planned strategic maneuver. I will protect his legacy, and I will keep your name out of the business journals. But if you hesitate for even 1 second, I will walk out that door and burn your family to the very ground." He stepped forward and shoved the expensive gold pen aggressively toward my chest. His chest was puffed out, his chin held high in absolute unearned triumph. He thought he had completely secured his multi-million-dollar theft. He thought he had successfully bullied his way into owning half of a logistics empire. He was fully convinced that he had won the absolute final battle of our bitter war. I slowly reached out my hand, still maintaining the slight artificial tremble in my fingers. I wrapped my hand around the cool metal barrel of the fountain pen, pulling it gently from his grasp. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the conference table. The heavy cardstock paper was neatly organized, waiting for my signature to finalize his massive corporate extortion. I stood there for 5 long seconds, staring blindly at the printed ink on the top page. Then I stopped shaking. The artificial tremble in my hands vanished instantly. The slumped, defeated posture of my shoulders disappeared as I straightened my spine and pulled myself up to my full height. The frantic, desperate breathing normalized into a slow calm and incredibly controlled rhythm. I lifted my head and looked directly into Derek's eyes. The fake tears that had been welling in my eyes were completely gone. In their place was a look of such absolute freezing cold clarity that Derek actually took a sudden involuntary step backward. His arrogant, triumphant smile faltered as he watched the terrified, submissive wife completely evaporate right in front of his face. He watched my expression harden into a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. I held his confused, panicking gaze for one final second. I wanted to make sure he completely understood that the pathetic woman he had spent years ruthlessly dominating was entirely gone. Then I opened my fingers. I let the heavy gold fountain pen slip through my grasp, watching his eyes track its rapid descent. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull, quiet thud that seemed to echo loudly in the tense, suffocating silence of the small room. "I prefer to sign things in public," I said, stepping straight over the discarded pen and walking confidently toward the locked door to face the waiting board. For 1 second, Derek remained frozen behind me. He had expected me to bend over the contract, not walk toward the door. Then he recovered and hurried forward, catching the handle before I reached it. "Do not try to turn this into another performance," he warned. "You agreed to surrender." I looked at the papers tucked beneath his arm. "I agreed to nothing. You gave me an ultimatum. There is a difference." His jaw tightened, but he did not stop me when I unlocked the door. He still believed the investors would finish what his threats had failed to accomplish. That confidence was exactly what I needed to preserve. The corridor outside was empty. The board members had already been escorted into the executive wing, and the noise from the relatives in the lobby had faded behind the security doors. Derek walked half a step behind me, speaking in a low, furious voice about obedience, reputation, and the disaster he intended to unleash if I embarrassed him. I let him talk. Every sentence pushed him deeper into the role he had chosen for himself. As we passed the darkened copy room, I slipped my phone from my pocket and opened the encrypted message thread without slowing my pace. Derek was too busy rehearsing his victory speech to notice my thumb move across the screen. "They took the bait. Move in." The delivery confirmation appeared instantly. I locked the phone and returned it to my pocket. Derek stepped ahead of me near the executive corridor and adjusted his tie in the reflection of a glass display case. The rage disappeared from his face as if someone had flipped a switch. By the time we reached the boardroom, he was once again the polished, patient executive burdened by an unstable former wife. "Remember," he whispered without looking at me. "Sit quietly. When I place the contract in front of you, sign it." I gave him a small, neutral smile. "Presented exactly the way you planned." He mistook my answer for surrender. Through the glass wall, I could see Barbara seated beside her brother, the fraudulent chief financial officer. 5 major investors occupied the opposite side of the mahogany table. Each man had received a polished folder containing Derek's version of the company's financial condition. Barbara noticed us approaching and gave her son a sharp, approving nod. She looked at my empty hands and assumed my evidence had disappeared. Derek opened the boardroom door and entered first. He moved directly to the head of the table, placing the surrender contracts in front of him like trophies. I followed at a measured pace. A row of small chairs had been arranged against the back wall for assistants and observers. Barbara pointed toward them, silently ordering me to take the invisible position she had assigned me for years. I walked past them. At the far end of the table stood the second executive chair, the one that had remained empty since Richard's illness. I pulled it back and sat down directly opposite Derek. Then I placed my slim leather briefcase on the polished surface. The movement changed the atmosphere immediately. One investor glanced from Derek to me, sensing that the story he had been told did not match the woman sitting calmly at the table. Barbara's smile stiffened. Her brother lowered his eyes. Derek cleared his throat and began distributing copies of the contract. He announced that I had recognized my emotional instability, agreed to step down, and voluntarily transferred operational control to him. He spoke slowly and confidently, making certain every investor heard the words, voluntary and permanent. When the final copy reached the end of the table, he looked at me and extended the same gold fountain pen. "Now, Amber," he said, "show everyone that we have resolved this privately." I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I unlatched my briefcase. Inside were the encrypted drive, the certified ownership documents, the continuity plan, and the evidence that would end their control of Apex Logistics. Derek's confident expression held for another second. Then I removed my laptop and placed it on the table. I connected it to the boardroom system. The massive screen behind Derek flickered to life. I kept my eyes locked onto the screen as I moved my cursor. Without making a single sound, I pulled up the first file from my encrypted drive. The massive screen illuminated with a crystal-clear side-by-side comparison. On the left was a legitimate vendor contract. On the right was one of the phantom invoices Derek had fabricated for a non-existent freight shipment. I clicked to the next slide. A highly magnified, incredibly detailed image of Derek's forged signature appeared on the wall, proving he had manually authorized the fraudulent payment. I clicked again. The screen shifted to display the raw, unedited general ledger. I highlighted the massive, unauthorized wire transfers, highlighting the exact dates and times Derek had drained the operational reserves, and then I delivered the final silent blow. I pulled up the direct deposit routing trails. The complex digital web of domestic shell companies appeared on the screen, tracing the stolen money step by step, until it formed a solid, undeniable line leading directly into the Cayman Islands bank account, registered exclusively to Barbara. The air in the boardroom evaporated. One of the older investors let out a sharp, horrified gasp. A seasoned venture capitalist sitting near the middle of the table dropped his pen, watching it roll off the wood and hit the floor. The initial confusion on their faces instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic. These were brilliant, ruthless businessmen. They did not need a vocal explanation to understand exactly what they were looking at. They recognized the irrefutable evidence of a massive multi-million-dollar corporate fraud playing out in high definition right in front of their eyes. Derek heard the collective gasp. He saw the investors staring in absolute horror at the wall behind him. He spun around, his perfectly styled hair shifting as he looked up at the projection screen. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, hollow ghost. He realized in a fraction of a second that his entire illicit empire was being broadcast to the very men he needed to impress. He let out a desperate, guttural shout and lunged aggressively across the mahogany table. He reached his arms out wildly, his fingers grasping for my laptop, attempting to physically rip the machine away and shut the devastating presentation down, but he was far too slow. Before his desperate, grasping hands could even brush against the keyboard, I reached out and slammed the silver laptop shut myself. The loud, violent crack of the metal snapping together echoed like a gunshot through the silent, glass-walled room. The massive projection screen behind him immediately went black, plunging the boardroom back into the harsh morning light. But the damage was already permanently done. The beautiful, polished illusion they had spent 3 years building was completely annihilated. The thick, suffocating arrogance in the room shattered into a million irreparable pieces, replaced entirely by the chaotic, desperate reality of sheer, absolute panic. The heavy silence that followed the cracking sound of my laptop closing did not last long. It was quickly overtaken by a rising tide of frantic whispers from the 5 wealthy investors seated along the right side of the mahogany table. They were abruptly pulling their expensive leather chairs back, distancing themselves physically and legally from the man standing at the head of the room. One investor hurriedly pulled a smartphone from his breast pocket, furiously dialing his private legal counsel. Another man rubbed his temples, his face entirely drained of color as he processed the sheer magnitude of the financial liability he had almost blindly walked into. Derek stood completely frozen, his hands hovering uselessly over the polished wood surface. The charming, charismatic mask he had worn for 3 years had literally melted off his face, leaving behind nothing but the raw, terrified expression of a cornered criminal. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Absolutely no words came out. I did not give him the opportunity to recover his voice. I stood up slowly from my chair at the opposite end of the long table, smoothing down the front of my tailored suit. I placed my hands flat against the cool mahogany, leaning forward just slightly to command the absolute attention of every single person in the glass-walled room. The frantic murmurs from the investors died down instantly. They looked at me with a newfound sense of profound respect. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying a clear, resonant authority that left absolutely no room for interruption. "For the past 3 years, you have been introduced to me as Richard's quiet, emotionally fragile daughter. You have been fed a meticulously crafted narrative designed to paint me as a submissive, helpless wife, unable to grasp the logistics industry." I let my gaze sweep across the faces of the 5 investors. "My name is Amber. I am a fully licensed bonded forensic accountant, specializing in corporate fraud. And as of 3 months ago, when my father legally restructured his estate, I am the sole exclusive owner and the unchallengeable chief executive officer of Apex Logistics." The declaration hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The investors stared at me, completely stunned by the magnitude of the revelation. But before any of them could formulate a question, Barbara erupted. She violently pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. She slammed both of her hands down on the table, her emerald necklace swaying erratically. "She is lying!" Barbara screamed, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged. "Do not listen to a single word she says. Those documents she just projected on the wall are completely fabricated. She manufactured those invoices because she is a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin my son. Derek built this company from the ground up. She is just a pathetic ex-wife trying to steal his sweat equity." I looked at Barbara, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I did not raise my voice to match her manic shrieking. I kept my tone perfectly level, projecting the effortless calm of a woman who held every single winning card. "You can scream that those documents are fake all you want, Barbara," I replied smoothly. "But the federal bank fraud investigators currently reviewing the raw server data will respectfully disagree. You see, I did not just stumble upon a few questionable expense reports. I systematically mapped out your multi-million-dollar embezzlement ring over 8 grueling months. I tracked the phantom payroll. I documented the forged signatures. And I handed the entire digital blueprint directly to the authorities." Derek suddenly found his voice. It was a weak, trembling sound, completely stripped of its usual arrogant swagger. "You cannot do this to me, Amber," he pleaded, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned blinding white. "We were married for 3 years. Everything connected to the company during that period is still subject to review. Everything you just gave to the authorities is going to drag you down right alongside me. You cannot shield the company from marital asset division. I have rights. I have legal protections." I let out a soft, chilling laugh, making the investors shift uncomfortably. I looked into his panicked, terrified eyes and prepared to deliver the final devastating piece of my plan. "You really need to start paying attention to the legal documents you signed, Derek," I advised, my voice dripping with cold finality. "Do you remember the stack of divorce papers I had delivered to your office last week? The ones you signed without reading because you were so eager to finalize the split and move your mistress into her new condo." Derek swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat rolling down the side of his pale face. He nodded slowly, his eyes wide with a growing, creeping horror. "Our divorce was not an emotional collapse," I revealed, watching his chest rise and fall with rapid breaths. "It was a meticulously timed legal maneuver. I did not file those papers because I was heartbroken. I filed them to establish a strict legal boundary between your criminal liabilities and my personal assets. I waited until the presiding judge finalized our divorce yesterday afternoon at exactly 1 o'clock. I paused, letting the precise timestamp echo in the silent room. I waited until the exact moment the legal tether between us was severed. The second the ink dried on that final decree, you lost every shred of marital protection you thought you possessed. You have no legal claim to my corporate trust. You have no legal standing to demand corporate backing for your criminal defense. I cut you off completely right before I dropped the hammer. The devastating reality of his situation crashed down upon him. Derek realized he was standing exposed in the middle of a federal fraud investigation. He had no corporate shield to hide behind. He had no marital assets to liquidate for legal fees. He had nothing but his own forged signature on dozens of fake invoices and a direct link to a Cayman Islands shell corporation. He was facing decades in federal prison, and he was facing it all alone. His legs gave out completely. He collapsed into the leather chair at the head of the table, burying his face in his trembling hands. The polished, arrogant executive was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal staring into the abyss of his own making. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. His voice broke as he begged me with desperation. "Please, Amber," he sobbed, reaching a shaking right hand out across the mahogany table. "Please take it down. I will do whatever you want. Please take it down." I stared down at his outstretched hand. His fingers were shaking so violently that his heavy gold wedding band clattered faintly against the polished wood of the mahogany table. He was bargaining with me, attempting to trade his sudden compliance for his freedom, but he had absolutely nothing left to offer. The wealthy investors sitting along the right side of the room watched him unravel with expressions of profound disgust and quiet disbelief. They were men who respected power and accountability, and Derek was currently displaying an embarrassing lack of both. I simply stood there watching the reality of his total destruction sink deep into his bones. "I am not taking it down, Derek," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "You demanded a public display, and you wanted complete transparency. I am simply giving you exactly what you asked for. Now you will have to face the consequences." Before he could plead his case, a sudden heavy sound broke through the tension in the room. The massive double doors of the executive boardroom swung inward with a forceful, synchronized momentum, commanding the attention of every single person present. The heavy frosted glass shuddered slightly as 5 individuals stepped confidently over the threshold. Leading the group were 2 federal investigators, wearing sharp, dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions. Their official badges were prominently displayed, clipped securely to their belts. Right behind them stood 3 uniformed Denver police officers, their utility belts clicking softly with every step they took into the room. The atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted instantly. The residual corporate tension was entirely vaporized, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the criminal justice system. The senior federal agent swept his gaze across the room, locating his targets. He stepped forward, his authority absolute and undeniable. The moment Derek laid eyes on the federal badges, his physical body betrayed him. His knees buckled beneath his expensive, tailored suit, and he collapsed heavily onto the carpeted floor right beside the mahogany table. He scrambled awkwardly onto his knees, grabbing the edge of the wooden table to keep himself from sinking all the way down. The polished, arrogant chief executive officer was gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate man stripped of all his manufactured power. He looked up at me from the floor, his face slick with sweat and tears. He abandoned all pretense of corporate negotiation and immediately pivoted to raw emotional manipulation. "Amber, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Please do not let them do this to me. We are married. We stood in front of our friends and promised to protect each other. Remember our life together. Remember the home we built. We used to be so happy. We used to love each other, Amber. You know I have a good heart. I just got in over my head. I made some stupid mistakes, but I am still your husband. You cannot just throw me to the wolves. Please tell them this is a massive misunderstanding." I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity for him. I felt no lingering attachment to the vows he had broken hundreds of times in expensive hotel rooms with his mistress. He loved the access I provided to my family wealth. He loved the comfortable, lavish lifestyle he could steal from my father company. His sudden invocation of our marriage vows was nothing more than a cheap, desperate tactic to save his own skin. While Derek was sobbing on the floor, Barbara finally realized the inescapable gravity of their legal peril. She looked at the federal agents and the uniformed police officers, and the last of her vicious, aggressive confidence completely evaporated. The arrogant matriarch who had kicked down my front door and threatened to ruin my life suddenly transformed into a fragile, terrified victim. She launched into a highly theatrical display of profound emotional distress. She threw her hands up to her face, letting out a loud, piercing wail that echoed harshly through the glass-walled room. She stumbled out of her leather chair, rushing around the side of the table to throw her arms protectively around her weeping son. Her brother, the fake chief financial officer, simply froze in his seat, his face drained of all color, too terrified to even move a muscle. Barbara dropped to her knees right beside Derek, clutching his shoulders and looking up at me with wide, frantic eyes. The fake tears flowed freely down her cheeks, smearing her expensive makeup and ruining her perfectly composed image. "Amber, you cannot let this happen!" Barbara cried out, her voice shaking with manufactured devastation. "You cannot let them take my boy away in handcuffs. I know we had our differences. I know we said some harsh things to each other, but we are family. We share a home. We share a life together. You cannot send your own family to a federal prison. Families forgive each other, Amber. They work things out in private. They do not destroy each other's lives like this. Please, I am begging you to have a little bit of mercy. Look into your heart and show some compassion for your family." I stood tall at the head of the boardroom table. I looked down at the two people who had spent the last 36 months actively plotting my absolute destruction. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated malice in Barbara's voice when she threatened to bankrupt my dying father. I thought about Derek pinning me against the dining room table, using my father's fragile heart condition as a psychological weapon to force my silent compliance. I thought about the incredible arrogance they displayed while draining millions of dollars from the company my father had built with his bare hands. They had shown me zero mercy. They had shown me zero compassion. And they certainly had never treated me like family. The federal agents took a step forward, reaching for the metallic handcuffs secured to their belts. The loud, definitive clicking sound of the restraints being unclasped echoed sharply through the quiet boardroom, serving as the final, undeniable punctuation mark on their fraudulent empire. I did not look away from them. I locked my eyes directly onto Barbara's terrified face, and then shifted my gaze to meet Derek, pleading, weeping eyes. I made sure they could see the absolute, unwavering conviction radiating from my entire posture. "Family builds you up," I said, my voice perfectly clear and steady, echoing with absolute authority in the silent boardroom. "Parasites bleed you dry. You never truly loved me or my father at all. You are just a bad investment I am finally writing off." The senior federal investigator stepped toward Derek and instructed him to stand. Derek did not move. He remained on his knees beside the mahogany table, staring at the badge as though refusing to rise could stop the consequences from reaching him. One of the Denver officers took him by the arm and pulled him upright. The moment the metal restraints closed around his wrists, the last illusion of his authority disappeared. Barbara tried to stand between her son and the officers. She shouted that the investigators had no right to humiliate a respected family in public and demanded to see their authority. The second federal agent calmly produced the documents and informed her that she was also being taken into custody in connection with the financial investigation. Her brother, the fraudulent chief financial officer, attempted a different strategy. He pushed his chair back and claimed he had only signed what Derek placed in front of him. He insisted that he had never understood the invoices and had merely followed instructions. The investigator opened an evidence folder and read back the dates on which he had approved vendor payments, altered ledger entries, and authorized transfers after legitimate accounting employees raised objections. His face went gray. Derek began pleading again as the officers guided him toward the doors. He promised to return every dollar. He promised to testify against Barbara. Then, when his mother screamed his name, he accused her of controlling the offshore account and keeping most of the money. Barbara responded by calling him an ungrateful coward. Their alliance, which had survived for years through shared greed, disintegrated before they reached the hallway. In the lobby, The remaining 18 planted relatives had gathered around the reception desk, waiting for Barbara to announce that their jobs had been restored. The moment they saw Derek, Barbara, and the fake chief financial officer in restraints, their confidence vanished. Several tried to leave through the side hallway. Others began insisting that they had known nothing about the fraud. Security was already positioned at every exit. The head of corporate security stepped forward with a stack of trespassing notices and called each person by name. Their employment had ended the previous afternoon. Their keycard system credentials, parking access, and authority to enter any Apex Logistics property had been revoked. Each person was instructed to surrender company phones, laptops, badges, and vehicle keys before being escorted from the campus. Brittany attempted to slip behind the crowd, carrying a company laptop against her chest. A guard stopped her before she reached the elevator. She claimed the computer was a personal gift from Derek. The asset tag proved otherwise. She placed it on the security desk along with her badge. The legitimate employees watched in silence as the family network that had dominated the company for 3 years was dismantled. At last, the employees who kept Apex alive could work without begging Barbara's relatives for approval every day. I remained in the boardroom until the last notice had been served. The 5 investors sat studying the evidence packets and the continuity plan. Thomas Henderson was the first to speak. He admitted that he had allowed Derek's charm and Richard's illness to replace proper oversight. He apologized for laughing at Barbara's insults during the gala and for accepting the story that I was incapable of leadership. The other investors followed. Their apologies could not erase what had happened, but their recognition marked the end of Derek's manufactured reality. I told them Apex Logistics did not need praise, it needed accountability. I presented the 90-day stabilization plan. The bank's compliance division would maintain protected funding for payroll, fuel, and essential vendors. An independent forensic audit would examine every transaction processed during Derek's 3 years of influence. Experienced managers would temporarily lead the departments previously controlled by Barbara's relatives. No executive appointment, vendor agreement, or capital transfer would be approved without documented review. The investors asked direct questions for nearly an hour. This time they did not interrupt me, laugh at my profession, or look toward Derek for answers. When the final question had been addressed, Thomas stood. He said my investigation had likely saved the company, its workforce, and their investments from collapse. One by one, the other investors rose with him. I had not built the case for their approval, but I accepted the standing ovation for what it represented. They were no longer applauding a charismatic illusion. They were acknowledging the person who had protected the business. 1 month later, the executive floor of Apex Logistics looked completely different. Barbara's oversized furniture had been removed. The locked cabinets her brother used to hide records had been opened and cataloged. The walls of the chief executive office were repainted, and the portrait Derek had commissioned of himself was replaced by a framed photograph of the first truck Richard purchased when he founded the company. My father sat across from my desk while I poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. His color had returned. The exhaustion around his eyes was fading, and his doctor had reduced some of the restrictions that had kept him isolated at home. Removing Derek and Barbara from his daily life had given him room to recover. The federal hold remained on the stolen funds while investigators worked through the recovery process. The independent audit had identified additional false contracts, but the company itself was stable. Drivers were being paid. Maintenance budgets had been restored. The legitimate managers who had carried the operation quietly for years finally had authority equal to their responsibility. Richard lifted his mug and looked around the redesigned office. I always thought protecting you meant keeping the worst parts of the business away from you, he said. I did not realize that silence was giving them space to hurt both of us. I sat beside him rather than behind the desk. I thought protecting you meant carrying the truth alone, I replied. We were both wrong. He smiled with the pride of a father who finally saw his daughter standing exactly where she belonged. Outside the windows, the Denver skyline stretched beneath a clear winter sky. A month earlier, I had walked out of the courthouse believing the divorce was the end of my marriage. I understood now that it was also the beginning of my authority. I had not inherited control merely because Richard placed shares in a trust. I had earned it by seeing what others ignored, preserving the evidence, and refusing to let fear make my decisions. I looked down at the first operational report carrying my signature as Chief Executive Officer. The numbers were honest, the roots were moving, the company was healing. For the first time in 3 years, so was I. What happened at Apex Logistics taught me that kindness without boundaries is not peace, it is permission. Derek and Barbara survived for years because they believed love, marriage, and family loyalty could be used as shields against accountability. They mistook my silence for surrender and my concern for my father as proof that I could be controlled. They were wrong. Real family does not demand that you ignore theft, humiliation, or abuse to preserve appearances. Real partnership does not require one person to become smaller so the other can feel powerful. And forgiveness does not mean restoring access to people who have repeatedly used that access to destroy you. I did not defeat Derek and Barbara by screaming louder than they did. I defeated them by documenting the truth, protecting the people who depended on the company, and choosing the correct moment to act. Evidence succeeded where arguments had failed. Boundaries succeeded where years of compromise had only encouraged more abuse. The hardest lesson was understanding that exposing someone is not the same as destroying them. Derek and Barbara made their decisions long before the agents entered the boardroom. The forged invoices, the offshore transfers, the threats and the extortion contract were theirs. I did not create the consequences. I simply stopped shielding them from those consequences. For years, I believed keeping the peace meant absorbing every insult and solving every crisis quietly. But peace built on fear is only a pause between attacks. Genuine peace began when I trusted my own judgment, told my father the truth, and accepted that people who benefit from your silence will always call your boundaries cruel. Sometimes walking away is not losing. Sometimes it is the first move in reclaiming everything someone tried to take from you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and the honest people around you is close the door, preserve the evidence, and refuse to negotiate with abuse. Have you ever had someone mistake your patience for weakness or use the word family to avoid accountability? Share your experience in the comments. If this story reminded you that your boundaries deserve respect, please like the video and subscribe for more stories about people who stopped apologizing for protecting themselves. Your kindness is valuable. Give it to people who know how to honor it.